Have you ever watched someone try to make a life or death decision for a child that isn't theirs? Not argue about it. Not question it. Just cancel it. Because that's exactly what happened in a quiet hallway at St. Matthew's Children's Hospital in Chicago. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Machines were beeping. Nurses were moving quickly. The air smelled like disinfectant and that faint sterile cold every hospital has. And in the middle of all of it sat Elena Rivera, 34 years old. Hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. Across the room, her 6-year-old daughter Sophie lay on a hospital bed, wrapped in a thin blue blanket that looked far too big for her tiny frame. Sophie's breathing was shallow, slow, uneven. Every few seconds, the monitor above her blinked with a warning tone that made the nurses glance over their shoulders. Because Sophie wasn't just sick. Her oxygen levels were dropping. And the reason they were in this hospital at 7:18 in the morning was simple. Sophie was scheduled for heart surgery. A surgery that had taken nearly 3 years of doctors, insurance approvals, consultations, and waiting lists to arrange. 3 years of watching a little girl struggle to keep up with other kids. 3 years of hearing doctors say things like, "We need to monitor her closely." 3 years of Elena pretending not to panic every time Sophie ran too hard on a playground. Today was the day that was supposed to change everything. The surgery had been scheduled for 7:45 a.m. But then something strange happened. Someone walked up to the front desk. Not a doctor. Not a nurse. Not hospital staff. Elena's mother, Margaret Rivera, 61 years old. Perfect posture. Gray hair pinned neatly behind her head. The kind of woman who spoke softly but expected people to listen. Margaret leaned toward the nurse behind the desk. Calm. Composed. And she said 2 words that made the entire morning collapse. Cancel it. The nurse blinked. I'm sorry. Margaret didn't hesitate. She repeated herself. Cancel the surgery. Now the nurse looked confused. Because this wasn't a haircut appointment or a dentist cleaning. This was pediatric heart surgery. The nurse turned to her computer screen. Ma'am, are you the child's guardian? And that's when Margaret said the sentence that froze the room. She's not real family. For a moment, nobody spoke. The nurse slowly looked past Margaret toward Elena. Because Elena was sitting right there. Close enough to hear every word. Close enough to stop it. Close enough to say something. But Elena didn't move. She didn't argue. She didn't shout. She didn't even stand up. She just sat there quietly in the plastic waiting chair, watching the entire situation unfold like she already knew how it would end. And if you were standing in that hallway, you probably would have asked the same question the nurse was thinking. Why isn't the mother saying anything? Why isn't she stopping this? Why is she just sitting there? But Elena had a reason. A very specific one. Because there was something inside Sophie's medical chart. Something Margaret didn't know existed. Something that would make this entire situation explode in ways Margaret clearly wasn't expecting. And sure enough, just a few seconds later, the elevator doors at the end of the hallway opened. A tall man stepped out wearing surgical scrubs and carrying a tablet. Dr. Daniel Carter, 47 years old. Head pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon at St. Matthew's. The man who had spent months preparing for Sophie's operation. He walked toward the desk, nodding politely to the nurse. Then he noticed the tension, the silence, the frozen expressions, and finally the words glowing on the nurse's monitor. Surgery status, cancelled. Dr. Carter frowned slightly. That's strange, he muttered. He reached for Sophie's chart, opened it, and started reading. At first his expression didn't change. But then his eyes stopped on a single line. Just one. A detail buried inside the medical record. The surgeon's posture slowly straightened. He lifted his head and turned toward Margaret. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the oxygen monitor beeping from across the hallway. Dr. Carter's voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge behind it. Ma'am, he said slowly. Who exactly canceled the surgery? Margaret folded her arms confidently. I did. The nurse looked uneasy. Elena still hadn't moved. But what happened next would completely change the atmosphere in that hospital hallway. Because Dr. Carter wasn't looking at Margaret anymore. He was looking back down at Sophie's chart. And the line he had just read meant something Margaret clearly didn't understand. In fact, it meant Margaret had just made a mistake so serious. It could stop everything she thought she controlled. But to understand why Margaret believed she had the right to cancel that surgery in the first place, we have to rewind a few years. Back to the moment Sophie first entered Elena Rivera's life. Because this wasn't just a disagreement between a mother and a grandmother. This was a family conflict that had been quietly building for years. And when it finally exploded inside that hospital hallway, no one was prepared for what the truth would reveal. But the first warning sign? It happened long before surgery day. Back when Margaret said something about Sophie that Elena would never forget. And, looking back now, that moment should have told Elena exactly what was coming. 3 years before that hospital hallway, Sophie Rivera was not supposed to become Elena's daughter. At least, that's what Elena's mother believed. Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how some families talk endlessly about loyalty until loyalty requires sacrifice? Because that's exactly where this story begins. It started on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in Chicago when Elena Rivera, 31 at the time, received a phone call that would change her life. The call came from a social worker, and the first words out of her mouth were not comforting. "Elena, we need to talk about your cousin Carla's daughter." Now, if you rewind even further, you'll find another complicated layer in this family story. Carla Rivera was Elena's younger cousin, 29 years old. Funny, energetic, the kind of person who filled a room with noise and laughter. But Carla had also struggled for years with addiction. And eventually those struggles caught up with her. When Carla passed away unexpectedly, she left behind one person who had no idea how drastically her life was about to change. A small 3-year-old girl named Sophie. At the time, Sophie was living in temporary foster placement while the state searched for permanent guardianship options. And technically, the Rivera family had a chance to step forward. But here's where the first fracture appeared. Because when Elena called her mother Margaret to talk about Sophie, the reaction wasn't what she expected. Margaret didn't sound sad. She didn't sound concerned. Instead, she sounded irritated. "Elena," Margaret said flatly over the phone, "that situation is tragic, but it's not our responsibility." Elena blinked in disbelief. "What do you mean it's not our responsibility?" "She's family." Margaret sighed. "Carla made her choices. Now the state will handle it." But Elena couldn't stop thinking about that little girl sitting in some unfamiliar home surrounded by strangers. So she asked the social worker a question that would set everything in motion. "What would it take for me to adopt her?" There was a pause. Then the social worker explained the process. Background checks, home inspections, legal paperwork, and something called kinship placement, which allows relatives to adopt children already within the extended family. It wouldn't be quick. It wouldn't be easy. But it was possible. When Elena told Margaret about her decision later that night, the silence on the phone lasted nearly 10 seconds. Then Margaret spoke again. And the words were colder this time. "You're making a mistake." Elena frowned. "How? You're 31. You're single. You have a career to think about. And now you want to raise someone else's child." Elena tried to stay calm. "She's not someone else's child. She's Carla's daughter." Margaret's response came instantly. "That's not the same thing." And right there, in that short sentence, was the beginning of a tension that would grow quietly over the next 3 years. Because Elena moved forward with the adoption anyway. She completed the home checks. She attended parenting classes. She spent months meeting with caseworkers and family court officials. Finally, after almost 9 months of paperwork and waiting, Sophie came home. 3 years old. Big brown eyes. Clutching a small stuffed rabbit that looked older than she was. At first, Sophie barely spoke. She stayed close to Elena, watching everything carefully like she wasn't sure how permanent this new life would be. But slowly, things changed. Within weeks, Sophie was laughing. Within months, she was calling Elena Mom. And for Elena, the decision felt completely natural. But not everyone in the family felt the same. especially Margaret. Margaret did visit once. Just once. It was a Sunday dinner Elena had organized in hopes of bringing everyone together. Sophie had spent the entire afternoon coloring pictures at the kitchen table. When Margaret arrived, Sophie ran up excitedly. "Hi, Grandma." Margaret froze for half a second, then forced a tight smile. "Oh, hello." Throughout dinner, Margaret barely spoke to the child. Instead, she kept asking Elena quiet, pointed questions. "Do you know anything about her father? What medical history does she have? What kind of problems might show up later?" Elena tried to brush it off as concern. But then Margaret said something that made the entire table go quiet. "You're raising a stranger's blood, Elena." No one responded. Sophie didn't understand the words, but Elena did. And from that moment forward, Margaret's visits became less frequent. Then eventually, they stopped completely. For nearly a year, Margaret barely saw Sophie. No birthday parties. No holidays. Nothing. Which is why, when Margaret suddenly called 2 weeks before Sophie's heart surgery asking if she could come to the hospital, Elena was surprised. Maybe even hopeful. Maybe this was the moment Margaret finally accepted Sophie as part of the family. Maybe she just needed time. But what Elena didn't realize yet was that Margaret hadn't come to the hospital to support them. She came with a plan. A plan she believed she had every right to carry out. And that plan started early on the morning of Sophie's surgery. Because just 40 minutes before Margaret walked to that hospital desk, she had already made a phone call that Elena wasn't supposed to hear. A phone call where Margaret quietly said 5 words that would soon cause chaos inside St. Matthew's Hospital. If necessary, cancel the procedure. What the surgeon saw inside Sophie's chart took less than 3 seconds to read. But those 3 seconds completely changed the energy in that hospital hallway. Because the line glowing on Dr. Daniel Carter's tablet wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning. Highlighted in red. Emergency surgical priority if oxygen saturation drops below 88%. And at that exact moment, the monitor across the room gave a soft but unmistakable alarm. Beep, beep, beep. The nurse glanced up. Then her eyes widened. "Doctor, her oxygen is 84. Let that sink in for a second." 84. For a healthy child, oxygen levels should sit comfortably between 95 and 100. Anything under 90? Doctors start paying attention. Anything under 85? That becomes dangerous. And Sophie Rivera was already there, which meant the surgery that Margaret had just canceled wasn't optional anymore. It was urgent. Dr. Carter slowly lifted his eyes from the chart and looked at Margaret. His voice was calm, but it carried the kind of controlled tension that makes people instantly stop talking. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "why was this procedure canceled?" Margaret didn't look nervous. In fact, she looked completely certain she was doing the right thing. "I canceled it," she said, folding her arms neatly. "I'm her grandmother." The nurse behind the desk blinked. "Ma'am, hospital policy requires the legal guardian to authorize that." Margaret waved a dismissive hand toward Elena. She agreed with me. Every head in the hallway turned. Elena was still sitting in the same chair. Still calm. Still quiet. Dr. Carter looked directly at her. "Ms. Rivera, did you request the cancellation?" Elena shook her head once. "No." Just one word. But the silence that followed was heavy. Because suddenly Margaret's confident posture didn't look quite so solid anymore. The nurse turned the monitor slightly so Dr. Carter could see the system log. "Doctor, the cancellation order was submitted through a staff login." That caught his attention. Staff login. Now the tension shifted. Because that meant someone with hospital system access had entered the cancellation. Dr. Carter looked back at Margaret. "Do you work here?" Margaret hesitated. "Not anymore." That single sentence opened the door to a much bigger problem. 20 years earlier, Margaret Rivera had worked in hospital administration at St. Matthew's scheduling department. Back before the hospital upgraded its systems. Back before patient records became heavily encrypted digital files. Back when access permissions weren't nearly as strict. And somehow, During a recent software migration, an old administrative credential tied to Margaret's employee profile had been partially reactivated. It wasn't supposed to allow medical changes, but the system had allowed her to open Sophie's record. And worse, submit a cancellation request. The nurse looked horrified. That shouldn't even be possible. But it had already happened. Dr. Carter's expression hardened slightly. Why would you cancel a surgery without speaking to the guardian? Margaret straightened. I was protecting my family. The sentence sounded dramatic, but the explanation that followed stunned everyone. Margaret believed the surgery was too dangerous. She had spent the past 2 weeks reading articles online about pediatric heart procedures, complication rates, recovery risks, rare surgical failures. And in Margaret's mind, the solution was obvious. Delay the surgery. Transfer Sophie to another hospital. Get a second opinion. Maybe even a third. But what Margaret didn't understand was something Dr. Carter had already explained to Elena months earlier. Sophie's heart condition had reached a tipping point. Waiting wasn't safer. Waiting was riskier. Dr. Carter tapped the chart again. Her oxygen is dropping because the valve isn't regulating blood flow properly, he said firmly. Every hour we delay increases the risk of cardiac stress. Margaret frowned. That sounds dramatic. And that was when the monitor beeped again. This time louder. The nurse looked up quickly. Oxygen 82. Across the room, Sophie coughed weakly. A thin, fragile sound that immediately changed the mood. Even Margaret turned to look. For the first time that morning, uncertainty crossed her face. Dr. Carter didn't hesitate. He turned to the nurses. Prepare the operating room. But before anyone moved, the nurse at the desk spoke again. Doctor, there's a problem. He looked back. Because the procedure was officially canceled in the system, hospital protocol requires administrative clearance before it can be restarted. In other words, paperwork, approval codes, electronic confirmations, things that normally took time. Time Sophie might not have. The surgeon exhaled slowly, clearly frustrated. Then he looked back at Elena. She was still sitting quietly, still watching everything unfold. And that's when Dr. Carter remembered something from a meeting 2 months earlier. A conversation Elena had requested privately. About family interference. About possible complications. About a precaution that most parents never think to ask for. Dr. Carter opened Sophie's file again and scrolled down. And there it was. Exactly where he expected it. A note attached to the consent authorization. He looked up at Elena. His voice quieter now. Did you know your daughter is pre-approved for an emergency surgical override? Elena nodded once. Yes. Margaret's head snapped toward her. What does that mean? Elena didn't answer. Because what that note allowed Dr. Carter to do next was something Margaret definitely hadn't anticipated. And within the next 60 seconds, the entire situation she thought she controlled would completely collapse. But the most surprising part? Elena had prepared for this moment weeks ago. And the reason she did was because she knew her mother better than anyone else. Here's the part of the story most people don't expect. Elena Rivera wasn't surprised when her mother tried to interfere with the surgery. Not even a little. In fact, she had quietly prepared for it. Let me ask you something. If someone had spent years showing you exactly who they were, would you believe them? Or would you hope they'd change? Because Elena had spent most of her life hoping Margaret would change. But 2 months before Sophie's surgery, something happened that made Elena stop hoping and start planning. It happened during a routine cardiology appointment. Sophie was sitting on the exam table swinging her legs while Dr. Carter reviewed the latest scans. The images showed what everyone already suspected. The mitral valve defect was worsening. Surgery couldn't be postponed much longer. After explaining the procedure and recovery timeline, Dr. Carter asked a simple question. Do you have family support for surgery day? Elena hesitated. And that hesitation said more than words. Dr. Carter noticed immediately. What's going on? So Elena told him. Not everything, but enough. She explained how her mother had never accepted Sophie. How Margaret had repeatedly questioned the adoption. How she believed real family meant bloodlines and nothing else. And then Elena admitted something else. My mom keeps asking about the surgery details, she said quietly. What kind of questions? Dr. Carter asked. Consent forms. Authority. Who can approve or deny procedures? That made the surgeon pause. Because those weren't the usual questions grandparents asked. Those were administrative questions. Control questions. And Elena had started to worry. What if she tries to interfere? Elena asked. It was a hypothetical at the time. Just a possibility. But hospitals deal with family conflict more often than people realize. So Dr. Carter suggested something simple. A safeguard. Inside Sophie's patient file, they added a special note. A security flag. Medical decisions may only be authorized or modified by legal guardian Elena Rivera. But that wasn't all. There was a second layer. An emergency protocol rarely used unless absolutely necessary. If Sophie's oxygen dropped below the safe threshold before surgery, Dr. Carter would be legally permitted to bypass administrative delays and proceed immediately. In other words, if something disrupted the surgery schedule, the medical team could override it. When Dr. Carter finished explaining the option, Elena sat quietly for a moment. Then she nodded. Let's do it. At the time, it felt like over-preparing. A precaution. Something that would probably never matter. But now, standing in that hospital hallway, Dr. Carter had just rediscovered that note in Sophie's chart. And suddenly Elena's calm made perfect sense. Margaret, however, had no idea what was happening. What does emergency override mean? She asked sharply. Dr. Carter closed the tablet. It means the surgery proceeds regardless of administrative changes. Margaret frowned. That sounds ridiculous. But the surgeon's attention had already shifted back to the nurses. Call the operating room, he said firmly. We're moving now. The nurse nodded and picked up the phone. Within seconds, the quiet hallway turned into controlled chaos. Staff moved quickly. A transport bed rolled forward. One nurse gently adjusted Sophie's oxygen mask. Margaret stepped forward. Wait a minute. I canceled the procedure. The nurse didn't even look up. That order has been overridden. Margaret's voice rose. You can't just ignore family decisions. That's when the hospital's patient services coordinator appeared at the desk. She had already been alerted by the system flag tied to the cancellation. Ma'am, the coordinator said calmly, you are not listed as the patient's legal guardian. Margaret turned toward Elena. Her voice suddenly sharp. Why aren't you saying anything? Elena finally stood up. Not angrily. Not dramatically. Just calmly. Because she knew something Margaret was only beginning to realize. This situation was no longer about family arguments. It had become a legal and medical issue. You tried to cancel her surgery, Elena said quietly. I was protecting you, Margaret insisted. Elena shook her head slightly. No. You were controlling something that wasn't yours to control. For a moment Margaret looked genuinely stunned. As if the entire situation had somehow slipped beyond her grasp. Then the transport team began rolling Sophie toward the operating room doors. Margaret instinctively stepped forward to follow. But a security guard gently blocked the hallway. Family waiting area is this way, ma'am. Margaret's eyes widened. You're stopping me? Hospital policy. The operating room doors swung open. The medical team disappeared inside with Sophie. And just like that, the hallway fell silent. Margaret turned slowly back toward Elena. Her voice was lower now. Almost accusing. You set this up. Elena met her gaze. No, she said calmly. I just made sure you couldn't stop it. But what Margaret said next in that waiting room would reveal something far deeper than a disagreement about surgery. Something that had been building quietly for years. And once those words came out, there would be no going back for this family. For hours. That's how long heart surgery usually takes when everything goes according to plan. But if you've ever waited for news during a surgery, you know time stops behaving normally. Minutes stretch. Every sound becomes important. Every door opening makes your heart jump. And that's exactly how the waiting room at St. Matthew's Children's Hospital felt that morning. Elena sat in a stiff blue chair near the window, hands folded in her lap. The sunlight outside had shifted slightly, but inside the room the air felt frozen. Across from her, Margaret paced slowly back and forth, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. Neither of them spoke for nearly 20 minutes. The tension between them was thick enough to feel. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. "You embarrass me back there." Elena blinked slowly. That was the first thing her mother chose to say. Not concern for Sophie. Not fear about the surgery. Embarrassment. "I embarrassed you?" Elena repeated quietly. Margaret crossed her arms. "Yes, in front of those doctors. Like I didn't matter." Elena let out a slow breath. For a moment she didn't respond. Because suddenly something became painfully clear. They weren't sitting in the same emotional reality. Margaret was thinking about pride. Elena was thinking about survival. "You tried to stop a life-saving surgery," Elena said calmly. Margaret shook her head immediately. "I tried to slow it down." Her oxygen was dropping. Doctors exaggerate risks all the time. That sentence hung in the air for a moment. Then Margaret said something that shifted the entire conversation. Something Elena had probably suspected for years. But hearing it out loud was different. "I just didn't want you throwing your life away." Elena frowned. "My life?" Margaret sighed like she was explaining something obvious. "You adopted a child with medical problems. A child whose history you barely know. Sophie is family." Margaret shook her head again. "No, Elena. She isn't." The words landed like a stone in the room. "She's Carla's child. Carla made bad decisions, and now you're paying for them." Elena stared at her mother. And suddenly all the small moments from the past 3 years started connecting. The missed birthdays. The distant phone calls. The lack of interest. Margaret hadn't been slowly warming up to Sophie. She had been quietly rejecting her the entire time. "You really believe that?" Elena asked softly. Margaret's answer came without hesitation. "You deserve your own family someday." There it was. The truth Margaret had been holding on to. To her, Sophie was temporary. A detour. A mistake Elena would eventually correct. But Elena leaned forward slightly. And when she spoke, her voice was steady. "I already have my family." Margaret opened her mouth to respond. But at that exact moment, the waiting room doors swung open. Both women turned. Dr. Daniel Carter stepped inside. Still wearing surgical scrubs. Mask pulled down around his neck. And for a moment, he didn't say anything. Which, if you've ever been in a hospital waiting room, is the longest moment imaginable. Margaret looked nervous now. Elena's heart pounded. Finally, Dr. Carter smiled. A small, tired smile. "The surgery went very well." Elena exhaled so suddenly she almost laughed. 4 hours of tension released in one breath. "The valve repair was successful," he continued. "Her oxygen levels stabilized immediately once circulation improved." Margaret blinked. "You mean, she's okay?" Dr. Carter nodded. "She's going to recover just fine." Elena covered her mouth with her hand, tears forming in her eyes. All the fear she had been holding back since dawn finally surfaced. Dr. Carter continued explaining the next steps. Recovery monitoring. Medication. Follow-up visits. Within a few months, Sophie would likely have the energy of a completely normal 6-year-old. Running. Playing. Doing everything her heart had struggled to allow before. But before leaving, the surgeon paused. "There is one more thing." Both women looked up. "Our administration department will be reviewing the earlier system access issue," he said calmly. "Unauthorized interference with patient treatment is taken very seriously." Margaret's face stiffened slightly. But Dr. Carter didn't elaborate further. He simply nodded politely and left the room. The waiting room fell quiet again. But now the silence felt different. Margaret looked at Elena. "You reported me?" Elena shook her head. "I didn't have to. Because the truth was simple. Hospitals protect patients. Especially children." Margaret stood there for another moment. Then slowly grabbed her purse. "You've made your choice," she said quietly. Elena nodded. "Yes. I did." Margaret walked toward the door. But before leaving, she paused. "You'll understand someday." Then she disappeared into the hallway. Elena didn't chase her. She didn't argue. Because right now there was only one thing that mattered. An hour later, a nurse guided Elena into the recovery wing. Inside a quiet room, Sophie lay sleeping under warm blankets. Small oxygen tube. Tiny bandage across her chest. But her breathing was steady. Strong. Healthy. A few minutes later, Sophie stirred slightly. Her eyes opened halfway. She looked at Elena and whispered softly, "Mom?" Elena leaned forward instantly. "I'm here." Sophie blinked sleepily. "Did they fix my heart?" Elena smiled, brushing a strand of hair away from her daughter's forehead. "Yes," she said gently. "They fixed it." Sophie thought about that for a second, then murmured something that made Elena laugh through her tears. "Good, because I want to run at recess." And just like that, the entire reason for the fight, the surgery, the fear, became beautifully simple. Sometimes family isn't about blood. It's about who stays, who fights, who refuses to walk away when things get hard. And on that hospital morning, Elena Rivera proved exactly what kind of family Sophie truly had.